I'm going to go to the gentleman right at the back, and then the gentleman over there, and then the gentleman down here. The gentleman standing at the back.
A quick question for Vince Cable. In terms of the sectors that probably need to learn a lesson from what's happened in the last year and a half, particularly the city, the finance sectors, do you think there's enough will in Parliament to ensure that those lessons are enforced, do actually happen, or do you think it's possible we go back to the bad old ways? Because I'm not convinced that the measures are in place to deal with that in the future.
I'm worried for the reason implied in your question that business as usual is very much the mantra of the moment. Let's just get back to doing things that we were doing before, and it's potentially dangerous because Britain's banking sector grew to a scale where, if you add up the balance sheets of the leading banks, they were about 400 to 500% of our GDP, right? That's 3 or 4 times bigger than in France or Germany, 5 or 6 times bigger than in the United States. We were getting towards a kind of Iceland type situation where the economy is top heavy, it's driven by the priorities of a handful of global banks, which is okay when they're doing well, but if they go bust, they drag the whole economy down with them, and that is not healthy. And we are constantly being told, we shouldn't stop the bonus culture, we shouldn't impose strategic imperatives to lend to sound companies because this will prevent them getting back to what they were doing before. And I share your concern that the City of London has become too big a part of the British economy. I agree with the previous intervention. The British economy has become horribly unbalanced, and we are going to have to be quite tough in taking on some of the vested interests in the financial sector.
Does the panel think that we're going to make a profit out of our bank shares at some point? And roughly when will that happen? And secondly, Dr. Cable was mentioning about looking at how big the banks are and potentially making them smaller or breaking them up somewhat. And given that HSBC or Midland or whatever we want to call it these days is a very, very large multinational bank, how does a broken up Lloyds compete with HSBC?
You've got to be very careful when you use the word bank. What do we mean by a bank? I mean, as a businessman, and this is a business conference, as a businessman, I expect certain things from a bank. Now, the things that I expect from them are all about dealing with me and my business, and possibly a bit of domestic banking at home. I understand what that is, and you mentioned Midland Bank. When I first started work back in the days of yore, I went to Midland Bank because they had a branch at the bottom of my road. So that was my relationship with them. Now, the bits that have gone bust are not what I know as banks. What I'm interested in as a businessman is how do I get finance to say, I want to lay some new tracks at the work, because I think there's a market out there. Let's spread that over 3 or 4 years. Let's see what we can do. That's banking. I understand that. It seems to be on a bit of a hold at the moment. But the bits that have gone out, again, it's this same business of using one term to cover 2 things. I think the things that went to the wall and cost untold billions weren't banks, as I understand it. They were some form of glorified gambling. And so I think it depends. If you break Lloyds or somebody else up into something that serves me as a businessman, I will use it. I really don't care what name's on the door. I will use them because they will provide a service. That's probably not going to make the untold billions that they made and have since lost. I don't really care about that, except for the fact I've had to stick my hand in my pocket to pay for whatever it is they're doing at the moment. So I do wonder if maybe the problem with all of the banks and everything else came to the fact that they stopped worrying about lending money to you and me so we can create wealth in the economy, and they started to play on the international roulette wheels. And so when they'll make profit is maybe when they go back to actually doing banking and stop playing tiddlywinks, because as I understand it, they all got involved like lemmings because one found this great scam. I thought, that's a good idea, and we need to show growth to impress our mates in the city because we need to be growing by this incredible rate. We've got X% growth. Let's all have a go in that. And they all pardoned, and of course it disappeared. And the ones that I understand, HSBC, which is fortunately my bank, didn't get too involved in that, and as a result they didn't post a spectacular growth, but they just carried on at so many percent a year, and as a result they haven't had to come to ask for any money from me. So I think you have to understand what a bank is first. So if we can have a bank that does business, yeah, I'll talk to that, but I really don't care what they do overseas in the American property market.
Definition of a bank from the university?
a conversation about, you were saying about how to be competitive. How can they be competitive with the larger banks? I mean, I would have thought that in terms of breaking up the banking system, that the smaller banks have got the opportunity to be more flexible, less bureaucratic, a bit more responsive to what people want. I think when you get into the big, large banks, they become sort of very tied and sort of hidebound to a certain extent. And it's the smaller businesses that have got that ability to be able to respond a bit more quickly, to be more customer friendly. And say as part of the survey that we were doing for Informing Our Future, we actually did contact a few banks, smaller ones, and what they were saying was that they actually did sort of think about that and sort of, what customer needs were and trying to be more responsive. And I think that's how you compete, because that's what the larger banks are not providing and not offering. And so I think it is a cause for optimism in terms of breaking up the structure.
We'll just come back on whether we make a profit selling the shares in the banks. I pose it back as another question. When did governments last make a profit from selling something back?